Hello, dear students. Level 6 Western Intellectual History course. This is Dr. Maha Salam, and I am recording to you our third video. Actually, this third video is related to a kind of activity that I have asked you to do in our last lecture. You remember the last lecture about the political philosophy of three philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. You remember the social contract, and you remember what they thought about the origins of the state. And at the very end of the lecture, I was recommending that you watch a famous movie, an award-winning movie. It's not a new one. Actually, it was produced in the year 1954, following the Second World War, in the decade following the war, and it is a movie by a Japanese director, a famous director, Akira Kurosawa, and this movie, Seven Samurai, is considered to be part of the reviews and the arguments and the debates about the origins of the state. First of all, the good news is that you don't need to study this movie as part of your syllabus, but if you have done your homework, if you have read the three philosophers that we studied and discussed last lecture, in our final lecture, in the classroom lecture, so you will be intrigued by watching such a movie, and maybe your first reaction would be like one of surprise. How come that a movie which is set in a small village in 16th century Japan, and Japan actually does not belong to the Western world, Japan is the Orient, if you like, and how come that such a movie which is about bandits, armed bandits, and samurai, those noble fighters who are fighting in defense of the villagers who asked for their help, how come that this movie is related to the origins of the state? And let me tell you that all the philosophers, including the three that we have studied, when they were talking about the state of nature or what was happening before we had communities and governments and certain systems of ruling, all what they did was like imagining things or thinking of a myth, a foundational myth about how come that all humanity is now living under the form of states, whether the states are monarchies or republics or empires or whatever. So this movie can be considered as the foundational myth, the Japanese version or the Kurosawan version of the foundational myth of the origins of the state. Well, as you see here, I have photocopied parts of some pages from a book by a Nobel Prize winner, J.M. Coetzee. He is a white South African writer, and I intend to say white because you know that South Africa had a special history about the apartheid between the white elite minorities and the majority of the Africans or blacks, and this has come to an end with Nelson Mandela, and nowadays we are supposed to have the new South Africa where everybody is treated equally and where apartheid supposedly has come to an end. Now, J.M. Coetzee has always been an author with a certain robust ethical stance, if I may say. He is always on the side of freedom and equality. He has written many interesting novels, and his novels are quite a challenge to read and to understand properly. And these pages or these extracts are taken from a book which is not particularly a novel, rather a group of essays and some narrative related. It's a very special sort of book. So I have extracted part from an essay that he entitled, Coetzee entitled The Origins of the State, and he chose this movie as an example. The story told in the film is of a village during a time of political disorder, when the state has in effect ceased to exist, and we are told about the relations of the villagers with a troop of armed bandits who would descend every season upon the village and commit all sorts of atrocities, killing and raping and stealing and all sorts of atrocities. And the villagers asked 7 noble samurai to come and defend them, and they defended them. And actually, they were victorious, but in a certain twist, the samurai themselves offered to remain as the heads or the rulers of the village and like to take the place of the bandits in like being parasites on the villagers. So, according to this movie, the villagers were left with an option either to accept the seasonal invasions and raids by the armed bandits and to be like obliged to pay them tribute or taxes or money or whatever in order to defend their lives, to defend their existence, or to accept the offer of the samurai that they would stay with them on a permanent basis and give them the necessary protection in return for remaining with them and ruling them and getting all the benefits, whether we call them tribute or taxes or salaries or whatever. Now, as we said, the villagers rejected to have the samurai stay on a permanent basis, opting instead for like we can use them or we can hire them whenever we like, because if we hire them, we are still in command or in control of our lives and freedoms. But if we are accepting their offer to remain permanently, then we are going to be turned gradually into slave population. Now, at the end of this movie, you have this question on the slide. Does this ancient legend from Japan relate to the thought of any of the modern Western philosophers you have studied? I have been mentioning 3 philosophers, Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, because these are the ones who talked more about the origins of the state, whereas the 4th philosopher, Montesquieu, was more interested in describing the contemporary political life in France during his time in the 18th century. That is why I haven't been mentioning his name throughout this video about the origins of the state, as his work is at a later stage, if you like. Again, the video is related to an extracurricular activity. It is related to an exercise in critical thinking powers, and it is not to be studied as course material for the exam.